Sometimes destruction doesn't begin with a scream. Sometimes it begins with a smile. When I first walked into the boardroom as head of strategic development, I felt proud. Not because of the title, not because of the salary, but because I had earned it, every inch of it. 10 years. Sleepless nights. Emergency business trips. Negotiations that lasted until sunrise. Projects everyone else had abandoned. Projects I dragged back from collapse within weeks. I believed in competence. I believed that skill protects you. I was wrong. My husband Igor used to say his mother was simply a strong woman. She's just strict, he would explain whenever she criticized the way I spoke at events. She wants the best for us, he would add when she commented on how I dressed or how I presented financial projections. Larisa Viktorovna owned a major logistics corporation. She was a woman who controlled everything. Supply chains, managers, reputations, even how her family appeared in public. Power wasn't something she held. It was something she inhaled. And I did not fit her design. I didn't ask for permission to speak. I didn't lower my voice in meetings. And most importantly, I wasn't financially dependent on her. That irritated her more than she ever admitted. The day everything collapsed started like any other. Board agenda, financial models, presentation of a new contract. I confidently projected my forecast onto the screen. Every number was verified, every risk calculated. Then the chairman interrupted me. Alina Sergeyevna, can you explain the discrepancies in these documents? The screen changed. Contracts I had never seen before. Altered amounts. Adjusted clauses. My signature, or something that looked like it, at the bottom. Silence swallowed the room. I felt the temperature inside me drop. That's a forgery, I said calmly. Too calmly. The documents have already been transferred to security, someone responded. 2 hours later, business media exploded. Top executives suspected of financial misconduct. 10 years of reputation disintegrated in real time. I called Igor. He didn't answer. He came home late that evening. Avoided my eyes. Journalists called my mom, he said. She's in shock. Do you even understand what you've done? That was the moment I realized something irreversible. He had already chosen a side. Within a week, I was dismissed by mutual agreement. No recommendations. No public clarification. No defense. Colleagues stopped replying. Friends became cautious. The silence was louder than the scandal. That night, I received an anonymous email. One attachment. A contract file. I opened the metadata. It had been created inside Larisa Viktorovna's company. I stared at the screen for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't break. Something inside me crystallized. This wasn't an accident. This was strategy. She had expected me to defend myself publicly, to beg for reputation recovery, to collapse under humiliation. But she miscalculated one thing. I do not fight emotionally. I analyze. If she chose to destroy my career publicly, I would dismantle her empire strategically. Not loudly, not recklessly, but completely. And that was the moment the war truly began. There is a specific kind of silence that follows humiliation. It's not peaceful. It's suffocating. For weeks after my dismissal, I stopped correcting people. I stopped answering accusations. I stopped reading articles written about me. The headlines were subtle. Clever. Legally safe. Sources suggest irregular financial oversight. Internal concerns raised by board members. Company acts swiftly to protect stakeholders. No one directly called me a criminal. But no one defended me either. Igor began sleeping in the guest room. Not officially, not with a conversation. It just happened. Distance doesn't always explode. Sometimes it just quietly rearranges the furniture between you. His mother, on the other hand, performed grief like an award-winning actress. In interviews, Larisa Viktorovna expressed deep disappointment. She spoke about betrayal within leadership. She emphasized how painful it was when trusted individuals lose their ethical compass. She never said my name. She didn't have to. I watched one interview in full. She wore pale blue. Soft makeup. Calm voice. Controlled sadness. It was surgical. That was when I understood something crucial. She wasn't trying to destroy me emotionally. She was protecting her shareholders. And I had simply been a liability to remove. So I did the opposite of what she expected. I disappeared. No statements, no legal threats, no dramatic posts. While the public narrative solidified, I began auditing my own career. Every project I had handled, every vendor relationship, every signed contract. Not to defend myself, but to map patterns. If those forged contracts originated inside her corporation, then the forgery wasn't a spontaneous act. It required access, authorization levels, internal approval loops, which meant at least 2 people knew, maybe 3. And systems always leave fingerprints. I contacted a former colleague from compliance, quietly, not by phone, not by corporate email. We met in a cafe across town. He didn't want to be seen with me. I can't be involved, he said immediately. I'm not asking you to be involved, I replied. I'm asking you to confirm something. I slid a printed metadata report across the table. He didn't touch it. But he looked. And that look told me enough. You're not the only one who noticed anomalies recently, he said carefully. There were asset transfers last quarter. Structured strangely. Asset transfers, not illegal, but unusual. That night I opened public registry data. Larissa's company had quietly moved minority shares into a subsidiary 3 months before my dismissal. Why? Risk shielding. If a scandal emerged, primary ownership would remain insulated. She wasn't reacting to my misconduct. She was preparing for something larger. And suddenly, I was no longer the center of the story. I was a distraction, which meant if I looked closely enough, I might find what she was truly hiding. Igor asked me one evening, "Why aren't you fighting this?" I looked at him for a long moment. Because noise is temporary, I said. Structure is permanent. He didn't understand. That was fine. War is not announced. It is positioned. And while the world believed I was recovering from disgrace, I was studying the foundation of the empire that humiliated me, because if Larissa Viktorovna believed she had removed me from the board, she had underestimated something fundamental. I didn't need a title to access power. I needed information. And I was just beginning to gather it. Empires don't collapse because of enemies. They collapse because of cracks. And once you learn how to see them, you can't unsee them. I spent the next month studying public filings the way a surgeon studies anatomy. Ownership structures, subsidiary chains, director appointments, resignations, reassignments. On paper, Larissa Viktorovna's corporation looked stable, profitable, expanding. But when I mapped the flow of assets visually, something stood out. 3 newly created subsidiaries, all registered within 6 months, all holding small but strategically important percentages of logistics infrastructure contracts. Shell protection. But protection from what? Then I found it. A government transportation contract awarded unusually fast. No public tender competition records. No objections filed. Quiet approval. And 2 weeks later, internal asset reshuffling. Someone was preparing insulation layers. Not from scandal. From liability. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. If that government contract failed compliance review, penalties would be catastrophic. Unless responsibility had already been diluted across smaller entities, which meant if one subsidiary collapsed, the core company would survive. Brilliant. Cold. Calculated. And dangerous. That same evening, Igor confronted me. "Mom says you're digging into company matters again," he said. I paused. How would she know that? Silence. There it was. Monitoring. Igor wasn't just emotionally aligned with her. He was financially tied. I requested access to our joint financial statements. He resisted at first. Then, I insisted. 3 transfers caught my attention immediately. Large sums, quietly moved into accounts under his name, originating from a trust connected to his mother's foundation. Monthly. Regular. Conditional dependency disguised as family support. Control isn't always loud. Sometimes it's deposited. I didn't confront him about it. Not yet. Instead, I made another call. An old contact from an investment group I once negotiated with. Discreet. Strategic. Opportunistic. We met in a private office downtown. I need insight, I told him. Not exposure. Not publicity. He listened carefully as I outlined the subsidiary structure. When I mentioned the government contract, he raised an eyebrow. That's ambitious, he said slowly. Too ambitious. Meaning? Meaning, either they're extremely confident or they're extremely leveraged. Leverage. The word settled into place like a missing puzzle piece. If Larissa had overextended to secure that contract, she might have taken on private financing. Debt creates vulnerability. And vulnerability creates entry points. Would you be interested, I asked carefully, in acquiring minority positions in unstable subsidiaries? He studied me. You're not asking for revenge, he said. No, I replied calmly. I'm asking for positioning. There is a difference. Revenge is emotional. Positioning is mathematical. If we quietly accumulated enough minority influence in those satellite entities, we wouldn't attack the core. We would simply wait. Because if regulatory pressure ever touched that contract, control would shift. Not publicly, not dramatically, but decisively. That night, I looked at Igor sleeping, back turned toward me. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt clarity. Larissa Viktorovna believed she had removed a threat. But she had done something far more dangerous. She had freed me from loyalty. And loyalty, once removed, leaves only strategy. The cracks in her empire were small, invisible to outsiders. But I could see them now. And once you see a fault line, you don't need to push. You just wait for the right pressure. Power rarely collapses in one dramatic explosion. It weakens in increments. While the world believed I was rebuilding my life privately, paperwork was moving quietly through financial channels. Not in my name. Not directly. Through layered investment vehicles. My contact, Victor, structured everything carefully. Minority positions. Nothing aggressive. Nothing that would trigger defensive countermeasures. Just small percentages. 5% here. 3% there. Convertible options embedded in secondary agreements. From the outside, it looked like normal market fluctuation. From the inside, it was alignment. One of the subsidiaries holding partial responsibility for the government logistics contract changed hands subtly. No press release. No internal announcement. But Larissa would see it. She always monitored ownership reports personally. Igor began watching me differently. You've been calm, he said one evening. Is that unusual? I asked. Yes. He wasn't wrong. Grief makes people loud. Strategy makes them quiet. A week later, Larissa invited us to dinner. The invitation wasn't warm. It was formal. Her house was immaculate as always. Crystal glasses, controlled lighting. The illusion of serenity. She studied me across the table. You look well, she said. I've had time to rest, I replied. She smiled slightly. Rest is good. It allows people to reconsider their ambitions. Translation: know your place. But something in her gaze lingered longer than usual. Suspicion. Because 2 days earlier, a minor board notification had circulated internally. Change of minority shareholder, subsidiary asset holding division. Insignificant to outsiders. But not to her. Markets are unstable lately, she continued, swirling her wine. Unexpected investors appear. I held her gaze. Markets reward preparedness. A pause. A thin crack in composure. She didn't have proof. But she sensed motion. And sensing without evidence is the most uncomfortable position for someone who lives on control. Then the rumor surfaced. Not publicly. Internally. A compliance inquiry regarding transportation infrastructure allocation procedures. Preliminary. Routine. Harmless, officially. But audits are like hairline fractures in glass. You don't see the damage immediately. You hear it. That week, one of the subsidiary directors resigned for personal reasons. Another requested indemnity clause clarification. Board meetings grew longer. Tension began circulating inside her structure. And still, I did nothing publicly. No statements. No accusations. Because pressure works best when it appears natural. 3 weeks later, the official notice arrived. Regulatory audit, focused on procurement transparency for the government contract. Larissa convened an emergency executive session. And for the first time in decades, she wasn't the only one holding influence in the room. Minority shareholders requested document access. Procedural clarification. Risk assessment breakdowns. Perfectly legal, perfectly timed. I wasn't inside that boardroom. But through aligned votes, I was present in every question asked. That evening, Igor came home pale. "There's an audit," he said quietly. "I heard," I replied. He looked at me carefully. "You knew this might happen." "It wasn't a question. It was statistically probable," I said. He exhaled slowly. And for the first time, doubt flickered, not about me, about his mother. Larissa Viktorovna had built her empire on dominance, on controlling every variable. But she had overlooked one principle. Control weakens when ownership fragments. And ownership had begun to shift. The fracture wasn't visible from the outside yet. But inside the structure, the pressure had started. And glass, once stressed, never returns to its original strength. Audits don't destroy companies. They expose what was already fragile. At first, the regulatory inquiry was procedural. Document requests, timeline clarifications, procurement methodology reviews, routine. Then, the second request arrived, expanded scope, followed by a third, cross-entity transaction tracing. That was when panic quietly entered the room. The government logistics contract, the one shielded behind subsidiary layers, had discrepancies, not illegal at face value, but structured aggressively, risk-weighted unevenly. And when risk is unevenly distributed, someone carries more liability than they realize. Board members began asking uncomfortable questions. Why were certain asset transfers accelerated weeks before contract approval? Why were indemnity clauses updated retroactively? Why were debt instruments attached to subsidiaries without full disclosure to minority shareholders? Minority shareholders. That phrase now carried weight. Because through layered positioning, I had secured significant influence in the most vulnerable subsidiary, the one directly tied to compliance exposure. Not majority. Not yet. But enough to demand transparency votes. Larissa called an emergency private session with Igor. I wasn't invited. But Igor came home shaken. "She says this is political," he said. "Competitors pushing regulators." "Is it?" I asked calmly. He didn't answer immediately. Because deep down he knew something didn't align. Control requires confidence. And for the first time, his mother was defensive. Media began picking up whispers. Nothing explosive. Just cautious headlines. Logistics giant faces routine compliance review. Markets respond to uncertainty faster than facts. Share values dipped, slightly. Then further. And that was when I made the next move. Through Victor's investment structure, we exercised a convertible clause embedded weeks earlier. Our minority stake converted into conditional controlling interest in the exposed subsidiary. Legal. Contractual. Inevitable. Larissa received notification within hours. That evening, she called me directly. "First time since my dismissal. I assume this is your doing," she said without greeting. "I assume you're referring to market activity," I replied. Her voice was calm. Too calm. "You think this is clever?" "No," I said quietly. "I think it's structural." Silence. Then, "You're playing a dangerous game," I learned from the best. That landed. For years, she had viewed me as emotional, ambitious, manageable. But this wasn't emotion. This was architecture. 2 days later, regulators expanded the audit to include subsidiary debt disclosures. That triggered a covenant review with private lenders. And lenders don't care about pride. They care about exposure. Emergency board meeting. Minority shareholders demanded risk mitigation. Translation. Restructuring. Temporary removal of executive authority pending audit results. For the first time in decades, Larissa Viktorovna was asked to step aside from operational control, temporarily, officially, to protect corporate stability. The vote passed. Not unanimously, but decisively. Igor didn't look at me that night. He didn't have to. He understood. This wasn't revenge. Revenge would have been loud. This was transfer. Power doesn't vanish. It shifts. And as Larissa issued a public statement about cooperating fully with regulatory review, I watched markets stabilize slightly under new governance oversight. No scandal. No dramatic collapse. Just recalibration. Weeks later, I attended a shareholder briefing, not as an executive, but as a controlling stakeholder representative. Larissa entered the room. No longer presiding. Observing. For the first time, she wasn't the one commanding silence. She was subject to it. Our eyes met briefly. No hatred. No shouting. Just recognition. She had removed me from her board. But in doing so, she had forced me to build my own. And this time, I didn't need her permission to sit at the head of the table. Corporate shifts are clean on paper. Personal consequences are not. After Larisa Viktorovna stepped aside temporarily, the tone of the media changed almost overnight. No longer whispers about misconduct. Now it was language about governance review, shareholder restructuring, stabilization strategy. Notice something? My name disappeared. Quietly, as if it had never belonged in the scandal at all. Reputation, once contaminated, doesn't automatically heal. But doubt had begun to circulate. And doubt is enough. Inside the company, interim committees formed. Risk officers gained authority. External consultants were brought in to assess exposure. Larisa remained a shareholder. But she was no longer commanding daily operations. Control had shifted into collective oversight. And collective oversight is slow. It frustrates leaders who are used to unilateral decisions. Igor felt the pressure immediately. Family dinners stopped. Phone calls from his mother became shorter. Sharper. She says this is temporary, he told me. It might be, I replied. He looked at me carefully. You knew this would cost her. I didn't flinch. She knew what it would cost me. Silence filled the space between us. For the first time, he wasn't defending her. He was calculating. Financial strains surfaced subtly. Trust distributions paused. Certain personal accounts were under review. Dependency has a cruel side effect. When the source tightens, everything trembles. Igor had never truly noticed how much of our lifestyle was indirectly supported by his mother's structure. Now, he saw it, and with that realization came something uncomfortable. Vulnerability. One evening, Larisa requested to meet me alone. No lawyers. No board. Just us. We met in her office, though she no longer officially ran it. The room felt different, still elegant, but not dominant. You've made your point, she said calmly. I didn't make a point, I replied. I exercised rights. She studied me. You could stabilize this quickly. Yes. And you won't. Not without structural transparency. Her expression hardened slightly. You're dismantling decades of work. No, I said softly. I'm preventing collapse. She leaned forward. You think you're stronger than me now? I held her gaze. No, I think I'm independent. That was the difference she could never tolerate. Not power. Independence. She offered a compromise. Public restoration of my reputation. A formal statement clearing my name. A return, quietly, into advisory leadership. Conditional. I almost smiled. I don't want my old position back, I said. That unsettled her more than resistance. Because ambition she could fight. Detachment she could not control. When I returned home, Igor was waiting. She says you're tearing this family apart. I exhaled slowly. This family was built on control, I said. Not trust. He didn't argue. Because deep down, he knew. Weeks of tension accumulated. Unspoken resentments. Unanswered questions. Then one night he said the words neither of us had voiced yet. I don't know how to stand between you anymore. You don't, I replied gently. You stand where you believe is right. He didn't answer immediately. But I saw it in his eyes. For years, his loyalty had been inherited. Now it required choice. And choice is heavier. Corporate battles are strategic. Marriage fractures are personal. I hadn't set out to dismantle my own life. But war reshapes terrain beyond intention. And as regulatory findings moved closer to conclusion, one truth became clear. The final move wouldn't be financial. It would be relational. Because power shifts externally first, but it collapses internally last. And something in our home was already breaking. There's a moment in every conflict when tension stops rising. Not because it's resolved, but because it has reached its limit. The regulatory audit was nearing conclusion. Preliminary findings didn't accuse Larisa Viktorovna directly. She was too careful for that. But the structure she built had been flagged for governance irregularities and risk opacity. Translation. The system had been manipulated. Not illegally proven, but intentionally engineered. Private lenders demanded restructuring guarantees. Board members voted to implement permanent compliance oversight, reducing unilateral executive authority moving forward. Even if Larissa returned operationally, she would never again hold unchecked control. That was the real loss. Not money, not status. Control. Then she made her final move. A proposal circulated quietly among major shareholders. Stabilize leadership through reconciliation. Restore my reputation publicly. Reintegrate me into executive structure. Present the narrative as internal misunderstanding resolved. On the surface, it looked generous. In reality, it was containment. Bring me back inside the system. Neutralize external leverage. Igor approached me that evening with something different in his eyes. Not confusion, not defensiveness. Resolve. I need to ask you something, he said. I nodded. Did she forge those documents? There it was. The question he had avoided for months. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I opened my laptop, pulled up the original metadata report. Timestamp origin. Internal creation log. Linked administrative access ID. Then I showed him the second file. A cross-reference authorization trace, connecting the document creation to an executive assistant reporting directly to Larissa. I had never shown him this before, because timing matters. He stared at the screen. Long. Silent. She told me you manipulated everything, he said quietly. I know. She swore you were trying to take control. I was trying to build transparency. The weight of realization is heavier than accusation. Because once you see truth, you cannot return to ignorance. The confrontation between Igor and his mother happened without me present. But I heard enough afterward. Raised voices, a door closing harder than usual. That night, he didn't sleep in the guest room. He didn't speak either. Just sat beside me in silence. And silence, this time, was not suffocating. It was transitional. 2 days later, the official regulatory summary was released, carefully worded. Structured language. But one line stood out. No evidence was found linking former executive Alina Sergeyevna to procedural misconduct. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't apologetic. But it was clearance. Media adjusted their tone again. Former executive cleared in review. Subtle correction. Quiet restoration. Larissa's reconciliation proposal reached final vote. I declined, not emotionally, formally, through legal channels. Instead, I submitted an alternative motion. Permanent governance restructuring. Separation of executive authority from majority shareholder privileges. Independent oversight committee. It passed. Not unanimously, but definitively. Larissa Viktorovna remained wealthy, respected, but no longer untouchable. As for Igor, he stood beside me at the next shareholder briefing. Not in front of his mother, not behind her, beside me. Afterward, he asked one question. Was this worth it? I considered it carefully. I didn't start this to win, I said. I started it because I refused to disappear. There's a difference. War isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about boundaries. And for the first time since the forged documents appeared on that screen, the lines were clear. She had tried to erase me. Instead, she had forced me to become unmovable. Power had shifted, not explosively, but permanently. After the court victory, everything changed. It wasn't easy. Victory didn't erase the past. Responsibility was fully mine. Every decision, every action rested on me. The first month as CEO was intense. I reviewed finances, closed unprofitable areas, set up transparent reporting. Old processes were optimized. Department heads understood. Results mattered, not words. Loyalty had to be earned. Slowly, employees started speaking up, proposing ideas, taking action. The office stopped living in the past. Tension turned into focus. The company began to breathe again. Larissa Viktorovna tried to interfere. Media. Old contacts. Nothing worked. The company stabilized. Financials improved. Facts overpowered her manipulations. I was no longer a victim. I was the leader. In my personal life, it was time to close the past. Igor understood there was no future for us. We met once to settle everything. Calm. No emotions. Final distance. My team became my true support. They trusted data, not emotion. Together, we built a foundation for the new company. I started open communication. Ideas could be shared and executed. Trust returned. Growth followed. The old key contract, secured without pressure. Transparent, professional, fair. Every morning I walked into the office confident. The past didn't affect me. It was a lesson. They can ruin your career, but not your mind. Sometimes I remembered Larisa Viktorovna. Her cold eyes, her arrogance, but it was only a memory. The world knew who led now. I didn't enjoy her fall. I used the opportunities she left behind. 6 months later, the company grew. New projects, more routes, better efficiency, strategy over impulsiveness. True strength came from wisdom, not revenge. During a board meeting, I closed my eyes. The team discussed plans. I smiled. Reason and strategy had won over fear and manipulation. The past couldn't define the future. Only experience, intellect, and clear thinking could. The company was mine. The team was mine. The decisions were mine. And this was only the beginning. She could destroy my career. But only I could build my future.